Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ACE webinar, What Do Consultants Need to Know When Working Internationally? My name is Clive Anderson. I'm a director of WIG Group, and I am chair of the ACE's International Business Group and a board member of the ACE. My fellow panelists will now introduce themselves so that you can recognise their voices, and then I'll come back and do a slightly broader introduction. Thank you.
I'm Hannah Vickers. I'm the Chief Exec of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering.
And I'm Sheena Suda, the Senior Partner of Beal & Co Solicitors, which is a specialist construction insurance practice based here in London and Bristol, Dublin and Dubai.
And I'm Helen Murphy, and I lead Transport for London's international arm.
Okay, thank you very much. So you can see that we've got a broad panel made up of client-based experience, industry experience, political experience, some legal advice, and someone representing the industry, and myself, who does a fair amount of work overseas, both for international finance institutions, for multilateral and bilateral donors, and also for UK government clients as well. So by way of further introduction, this webinar forms part of the ACE's initiative around the future of consultancy, and in particular export opportunities and that particular work stream. I was delighted to chair a workshop yesterday afternoon in our offices in London, which had delegates from a number of ACE member firms, and we started to discuss some of the best practice in the industry about preparing consultancy businesses for working overseas, in particular the growing opportunities through the Department for International Trade, and in particular where the aid for trade money is now moving, particularly in alignment with things like the Prosperity Fund. So we had a 3-hour workshop that looked at answering a number of questions, which were things like what are the biggest markets for UK consultancies overseas? We looked at various territories, geographies, and also the services that our businesses should be looking to deliver. That varied from high-level advisory policy advice through to full detailed design, through the design development stage, scheme design stage, and administering the construction projects, through to an interesting idea that actually, as an industry in the UK that is used to making the most out of perhaps what might be described as aged infrastructure, we actually had some really developed services that could be offered internationally. We also looked at the countries where consultancies like ours, international consultancies, can easily work, because we do know that there are certain challenges, both from capacity and a whole variety of other governance issues that businesses need to think about. And I know Sheena will talk about that, and I'd like to reflect on that at a later stage as well. One mustn't forget that the primary objective for an organisation working overseas, and indeed in the UK, is the health, safety and security of their staff. And so that remains, for a board director, a very significant and onerous responsibility. So it drives an awful lot of what we do in my organisation, and I know that many members of the ACE consider that element of making sure their people are safe and secure is the biggest driver for us. We need to think about the support that is available through organisations such as the ACE, and indeed Department for International Trade, who are now looking at providing a much greater support network for businesses to go and operate in these areas. So we will also cover that, and in particular what filters need to be applied in the way that businesses start to look at opportunities overseas. And I think that's something that's really important for small and medium-sized enterprises, who need to be quite clear that it's an expensive business operating overseas, and sometimes making sure that you've got the appropriate partnerships, either in consortia or with local partners who can provide some of those larger support networks before heading off in a desire to go and work internationally. We still see problems as an industry with late payments in the Middle East, no payments in some jurisdictions, and the great concern about bribery and corruption, which for anyone working in our industry, particularly in international development, will create a massive problem for us. So no further ado, I will hand over to Hannah to give us a bit more of a review of the Future of Consultancy campaign. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. So I should have some slides. Here we go. So what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of context around what we're going to do with the information we get out of this event, and also where the sort of longer term ambitions are in terms of ACE helping our consultancy members to understand what the export opportunities might be. So we've started something called the Future of Consultancy campaign. This event is part of that. And what we're looking to produce during this campaign, so around October this year, we will be looking at trying to publish what we think would be a strategy which would have the consultancy industry in the UK behind it. So that would look at what we think the domestic markets are going to do and what opportunities we've got there with our clients, and also what our export opportunities are. And the value in us doing this as a collective is that we can then use that with the likes of the Department for International Trade to steer how they go out and market UK consultancy firms and the sorts of deals and effort and support services that they put in place. So we sort of need to give them a steer about what works for us as businesses, where we'd like to work, and if there are any gaps in terms of the support that's currently available. So that's what we're doing this year, really. We're also going to be doing a bit of member-facing work, and you can see in the bottom left of my slide, there's the Business Development Handbook. And what that's going to be is a collation of everything that's there at the moment that will help you to work overseas with your business. So that will be things like UK export finance and what products they have, as well as some of the opportunities that you might have with the likes of TfL International, who we've got with us today, to partner. So the different routes in. So that will start to give you a bit of a feel. If you want to move into exporting your expertise from your business, what's there to help you and support you in that journey. So there's a little bit sort of two sides. What are the opportunities? And actually, if you do, want to take that first step, what does it look like? Okay. So just to give you some key dates for that, I've already mentioned October is when we're going to put that, sort of publish that information. But you can see at the moment we're in this sort of engagement phase of the campaign. So what we're looking to get out of today is a bit of useful debate, some learning from the panelists, but also from yourselves. So please start asking those questions around what it is that you really want to know, because we've got a great panel here today who will be able to answer them, but equally if we can't, it gives us a steer around what we need to start thinking about putting into the campaign going forward. So just a little bit of a plug there for this. Is not just one way as talking at you this afternoon. And now just to close out a couple of things that we're looking to answer, and where, perhaps to set a framework for the discussion that we're going to have, where we are seeing, to start with, what we think the opportunities are. So what is it that actually British consultancy has that we might be wanting to sell? And Clive has already mentioned, the countries that we would like to move into. There's some really interesting things around the inputs to that. So the sorts of things we can base it on, as Clive has already mentioned, are things like where the UK government engages in prosperity funding, where the multilateral banks are looking at doing development funding, and also things like, from where the Treasury has the economic and financial dialogue with certain countries. All of those things will help us make our way into those markets, but there's a little bit of a steer for us to work out if those are the markets that we want to work in. So, for example, the Treasury has the economic and financial dialogue with China, India, Russia, Singapore, Brazil, and Hong Kong, and I suspect not all of those would be attractive to the consultancy industry. So, I said the next few months are about us looking at and sort of delving into that data around the size of the different markets, and then matching that with where we want to work. So that's the part of the exercise. We'll discuss some of that today, but as I said, there's plenty of opportunities to get more involved. I'll just move on now to how we're actually looking at positioning our offer. So if that's where we want to work, what is it that we think? And this is what's coming out to start with, so it may not be the final answer that we end up with, but just to give you an idea, we've worked out we think we've got 3 areas of capability in the UK that will be of varying interest to different countries overseas. But certainly the sort of, if you look at the top left there, the kind of system level strategic planning, how you do a national infrastructure plan, how you properly plan an integrated built environment. We think we are quite strong on that, and certainly from my time in the Treasury, that was where we would get a lot of intergovernment requests. So that was something that people were looking for abroad. So it's thinking about actually what, how do we develop and market our offer in that space. Down into the delivery of projects, I think this is perhaps where we're best known already for our sort of British design expertise overseas. We do get involved in a lot of the most complex design assignments that are happening overseas. Quite often it will be a British engineering company that is involved in that. So it's how do we capitalise on that and make sure that, again, that the likes of the Department for International Trade are doing their bit to help us. And then finally, one which I think we could do more in, which is around this operation and our expertise and understanding of asset systems and how they interact and work together during their whole life, because we do have, obviously, we're quite a congested country and we have a lot of aging infrastructure. So again, it's that capability which, you look to the sort of the likes of China and things, and you think they're going to need that going forward, actually, because of the rate of urbanisation and city growth that they are experiencing. So some really interesting angles there, perhaps expanding what we might be known for already, that we can start to explore. So that's a little bit of a flavour of what the research is telling us. Like I said, we've got an awful lot to do to filter through the long list of countries around the world, but that's what we'll be starting to develop really through this campaign. So I think I will leave it there for now and hand back to Clive.
Yes, thank you very much, Hannah. I think you've covered quite a significant amount of ground there, and particularly bringing in what we discussed yesterday, which is that suite of services that very much recognisable skill sets that we have in the UK. And I think the other thing that it is worth reinforcing is that whole point that you raised there about living on a relatively small island, but with infrastructure, primary economic infrastructure that has broadly been in place for at least 150 years and possibly longer, and we're still reliant on that. So I think by saying our knowledge and understanding of making do and mend, if I can use that expression loosely, we've got some very significant learning from experience. And equally, designs of our integrated transport systems, which have had to accommodate that very significant growth, and those lessons that we can take to some of those developing cities. And as we know, particularly in Africa, there is a huge population growth as people start, also a growing population that is moving from rural parts of the countries into the larger mega cities, which will be growing at significant rates. So I think that hopefully will be a really good segue for Helen Murphy, who's the Director of Consulting at Transport for London. So Helen, some thoughts and insights from you, please.
Thank you. So I was going to just start by giving a little bit of background to why I'm here, I guess, and why I've been invited to join this panel. So Transport for London was tasked by the Mayor as part of his manifesto when he was elected 3 years ago to set up and explore opportunities for a consulting division within Transport for London. The reason why the Mayor was championing that as an approach for the business was twofold. So first, to use some of the expertise we have within Transport for London itself to work with partner organisations and cities around the world, but also to help to develop, retain and challenge our staff that work within the organisation. So I've been with TfL for just coming up to a year. And I started in the role needing to set out a strategy about, well, what were we going to do, where were we going to do it, and how were we going to work in a global marketplace. So we have a huge amount of technical expertise in terms of tackling the policy, strategy and delivery challenges in London, but where is it most applicable to the global market, and how can we work most closely with the Department for International Trade, with partner organisations from the private sector, so other consultants, both in professional services space, but also management consultants, and then with the development banks to look at business opportunities. So having gone through quite an extensive market sounding exercise, trying to work out and triage what we're going to do first has been mine and the team's primary focus over the last few months. And in doing that, we have been governed very strongly by the ethical procurement policy that we have agreed with City Hall. And that's a very important point to mention. So colleagues on the panel here have spoken about some of the risks of working in countries that we all need to be aware of. And for us and the consulting work that we're looking to do from Transport for London, it goes a little bit further than that. So our ethical policy actually is based around the Freedom House classification of countries and making sure that we have an awareness of the social environments in which we might be taking forward some of our schemes, as well as the financial, economic and health and safety that have already been mentioned by others. For us, now that we have our strategy in place, we are focusing on perhaps some of the easy entry markets. So those such as North America and Australia and New Zealand, where the legal systems are more similar to ours, where English is the first language spoken by almost all in business, and where there is a big knowledge already from the expat community both ways of the sorts of skills and expertise Transport for London can bring into the marketplace. So they have been relatively easy doors for us to open and to move through. I think as well as that, we're also looking at opportunities in Latin America and particularly working very strongly with our central government partners from the DIT in some of the government to government relationships that are already established in other technical fields. And also in India, where there is a big programme of development funding from the UK government and where the multilateral investment banks are focusing quite a lot of their activity. So we've gone alongside them as technical advisors. I think from getting to the end of my first year in this new and challenging role and environment for me, and reflecting on some of the messages I wanted to share today, I think the key for us has been about trust with our partners. So we are not planning on setting up any legal entities overseas. We're planning on working from London. So we very much rely on the expertise, local knowledge and technical advice from partners in the countries we're working with to help us to navigate what opportunities to go for and then how to deliver them most effectively. And I think that that's something we might want to pick up in terms of our relevant experience during the Q&A part. And then I think also accessing the government support that Hannah was talking about has been extremely useful for us. So that network of DIT colleagues around the world are having conversations every day with the potential clients, the potential partners and the stakeholders in the geographies that we're interested in working with. And they've been provided really invaluable support for us in terms of the start of our journey.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative and great to hear that the Mayor had started that process by challenging the organisation in being able to, as you put it, retain, develop and challenge staff. Because I think that comes back to that point earlier about the importance of being able to create the opportunity for existing members of staff perhaps to travel overseas with the organisation, and certainly we're all in that war for talent, and being able to offer graduates or apprentices the idea of a future where they could go and work in some exciting parts of the world. But then recognising that there is a localisation agenda, which is the point that you raised at the end, which is that there is always a need, and in particular to be able to set up an entity in a particular jurisdiction to realise that there are certain regional requirements on the numbers of locals that you then employ inside the organisation. And much of that can sometimes come as a surprise to organisations who go to look look at working in those entities, particularly where, for example, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that we discussed yesterday, they have a Saudi Arabia 2030 plan, and much of that is around balancing their economy away from hydrocarbons, and then recognizing that over the generations when expats have gone to work there, that there hasn't been a huge amount of capacity building in country. So one of the other things that consultancies like ours and others are doing, I'd like just to put a bit of a thought out there, is that I think there's a lot that we can all do in looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and part of that will be around not just things like climate change and making sure that there's balanced gender education, but also that as part of what we do, there is an element of capacity building, so that there's a localization agenda into what we do. Thank you very much for that. So Helen's given us a view of Transport for London's interests and appetite in working in an international setting, being supported by Department for International Trade, which is really good to hear, because I think one of those insights is to actually figure out how we as private enterprise with the ACE then open up more dialogue with Department for International Trade, which I think has been quite I wouldn't say difficult, but it's been quite difficult to understand how we get through the door in the first place. So we know the offer of support is there, but getting to that is going to be something that we're quite keen to work on. So if we move now to Sheena Sood, who's a partner with Beale & Co, and many of us work quite closely with Beale's. I won't necessarily steal Sheena's thunder, but Beale's are a standout in many areas of support to engineering and consultancy work, both in the UK and overseas. So interested to hear what Sheena has to say about the experiences Beale's have from a legal perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. And I'm very keen that my session isn't seen as a negative session. We've heard a lot about some of the exciting opportunities for British businesses abroad. And you know, when a lawyer takes the stage, it's not always necessarily don't do this and putting up barriers. My session is really about giving you some high-level points so that you're really going into this area with your eyes open and aware of the risks that are about and the issues that, as Clive says, that we see day to day from clients that are working overseas. I thought the best way, in order to provide my views about what consultants need to know when working internationally, is to trace a construction project from start to finish and pick out 5 points, given the time available, that we see commonly arise, and imagine that this project is in Dubai and not in the north of England. So firstly, I thought I'd talk about contract terms, obviously, the need to understand the contractual framework in the country, the standard approach, standard forms, market norms, which is essential. And gaining that understanding prior to entering into competitions or bids, so that you can then price sensibly. Sorts of differences, I suppose, that we see with the Middle Eastern contracts, and I'm sure Clive will also have experience of this, is extremely onerous terms that we see very much pro-employer, a take it or leave it approach to terms, and really very little room for negotiation unless your bargaining power is extremely strong. Unlimited liability is the norm in the UAE. And then differences like the request or the demand, if you like, for tender bonds to be provided, which are very much like performance bonds that contractors are used to. And the situations that we've seen consultants face is really entering into tender processes, onerous terms as part of that bid, tender bond requested, contract might be awarded to you, and that's great. You then go and try to amend the terms, following advice from lawyers or in-house legal. Unsuccessful in doing that, you want to walk away from the bid, and the bond can be called upon. So we've seen consultants get bitten by that because it's not something that a concept really that they're used to with working in the UK. Certificates from local insurers can be an additional, so that they can be required, and they can be an additional cost that consultants might not necessarily price for. And then other contractual differences like pay when paid and back-to-back clauses, liquidated damages as well in design appointments, which are not common in this country, and penalties rather than genuine estimates of loss. So those are just some of the risks, and whilst I've mentioned the need to price for those risks where you can, also consider whether or not you've got insurance for some of those risks. Certainly liquidated damages is not something that you can usually insure against. Secondly, licenses and any local points for consultants working abroad. We've seen consultants in the UAE bitten by the lack of license, the right license, or limitations on the license that they may not necessarily be aware of. So site presence, for example, has been one where the license may not extend to the engineer or the architect being on site, and therefore they're slapped with a fine. And the concept of an architect of record in the UAE, where you need to have the right license to be able to operate as an architect of record. So making sure that you're aware of the local licenses and requirements of the profession in any individual country that you're working in. I mean, the next topic, which is during the project, is probably the most, this is where we get the most requests for help to do with payment. So the environment obviously very different in the UAE as my example country. You don't have the same protections, if I can call them that you're offered by the Housing Grants Act, for example, in this country, which outlaws pay when paid, provides an ability to suspend for non-payments. You don't have, again, protections in inverted commas that you might have by the Prompt Payment Code and the recent Small Business Enterprise Employment Act, where there are now more and more pressure on businesses to be paying their supply chain promptly. So unless you've written it into your contract, you won't have an ability to suspend for non-payment or an ability to adjudicate to get faster payments. So your recourse is often the sort of unpalatable dispute resolution provisions that you might have in your contract, which I'll come back to. Other issues on price to consider is price escalation and exchange rate risk, building in provisions into your appointment which allow for adjustments, but remembering obviously that can work both ways on currency fluctuations. And then two other points that we've seen common: payment being linked to milestones, key deliverables, which is fine, we're used to that in the UK, but quite often those milestones are attached to approvals that are needed by third parties over which you're not going to have any control, and obviously can cause additional delay in payments. Retentions are common in design appointments. 10% retention is fairly common in the UAE, and a practice that we hear about time and time again is that the final invoice is just simply not paid. You know, it's effectively the retention. So those are just some points on payment to bear in mind. One that we've been bitten by as a firm is in delivering services from the UK. Bear in mind that some countries will impose withholding tax that can only be reimbursed if you've got the necessary treaties in place with those countries. So that's all about the important topic of money. Bribery and corruption has been mentioned already, but it's just something to be aware of, that the UK Bribery Act will impose requirements on businesses, even if you're operating in other countries where there isn't similar bribery legislation. So your obligations under the Bribery Act to have in place adequate procedures apply equally to transactions overseas, where fairly obviously there could be cultural practices ingrained which are at odds with the law that you're obliged to follow. And then finally, dispute resolution. Sort of our stock advice on dispute resolution is to have a dispute escalation clause in your contract, which allows for senior exec meetings, CEO meetings, mediation before you get to the worst case scenario of court proceedings or arbitration. Our preference is that where possible to avoid the local courts, unless you're in the EU or the DIFC in Dubai or an equivalent free zone court. Otherwise, arbitration is better because you allow yourself some control over the dispute and how it's going to be handled. The procedure, the seat, the language is kept confidential, and you'll have a final decision which can usually be enforced abroad. Just to be careful on arbitration clauses, there has been a run of case law about the need for clear drafting of those clauses and authority. By that I mean powers of attorney in the UAE, for example, which allow the signatory to actually execute an arbitration clause, otherwise it will be held invalid. So yeah, I mean, just back to my first point, which is that there are exciting opportunities. I was reading in preparation for this talk, the Turner & Townsend Global Construction Market Survey, just published this year, and it's quite a useful read. It talks about the hotspots, some of which we've mentioned. It talks about the cold spots, and it gives an overall positive picture about working overseas. Despite global economic challenges, construction, according to this survey and report, is said to be an area that may well bypass some of those challenges. Thank you.
Sheena, thank you very much for that comprehensive assessment, and I'm sure there's a number of my colleagues who are dialing in who, dare I say, when I heard terms like unfair terms and conditions and then unlimited liability and take it or leave it, I thought you were talking about UK government for a moment. So forgive me for that, but yes, I think certainly some of those we are aware of in the UK, but some of those others are entirely unique to those jurisdictions. So things like tender bonds and non-payment of that final retention and then damages for unliquidated and ascertained damages, very, very unique to those jurisdictions. And I think despite what you said you try and set out to do at the start, you probably have identified quite a number of red flags, which absolutely are, when we as a business look at operating in any of those jurisdictions, we do go through, and a bit of feedback here, we go through a very clear go, no-go strategy, because we do find that some directors in our organisation get quite seduced by corporate tourism, and that sort of, as I call it, the smell of aviation fuel seems to ignite all sorts of exciting opportunities in their minds, and then we start calming people down and start saying, well, before we go any further, let's understand what the project is, what the opportunity is, who the client is. Let's start doing some due diligence on that customer to make sure that we're not finding ourselves in any kind of difficulties from either a sanctions point of view or from a concern about bribery and corruption. And then going through on the legal side of things, so there's probably at least half a dozen that you flagged there that would immediately be red flags. And I talked about governance earlier, and any business has to recognise that governance is hugely important, and we don't go through that go no-go gate if there's any red flags without referring it to our PLC. For those very same reasons, that if you're bound into unlimited liability and potential parent company guarantees, you're potentially signing the business up to a risk that could undermine the entire group. So very, very sensible. But it's amazing that if one doesn't have that kind of experience, how easily it is to get in a very difficult headlock. So I think just for me, reflecting on a couple of other things that were mentioned there, once again, we often think that the experiences that we might have in the UK provide a very good grounding for working in an international environment. But you can start seeing, particularly in places like the UAE, that there's a culture around the way that those countries have operated. They've got a different legal system. So we need to be aware that in certain of those Muslim countries, you could be subject to Sharia law as opposed to any recognizable international law as well, which I think also creates some real challenges. And I think the final point on pricing, the other one that I think often is a big red flag for us is, as consultancies, we're so used to pricing on the basis of selling hours. And so in the case of TfL and moving overseas, yes, you'd have an understanding of what your rate card is for selling services, but all of a sudden you then start pricing things like travel and subsistence and a whole bunch of logistical aspects that often we don't necessarily think about in quite the same way. So in the UK, yes, we might go and do that project in the north of England with a team based in London, and we can figure out how much that's going to cost. But all of those elements to do with logistics, and it does become a logistical challenge, and those withholding tax elements start making the sort of not just the legal but the commercial aspects of how you put together a bid very, very important. And it's not just about the hours that you anticipate using to deliver the service. There's a very significant list of additional aspects that need to be considered. Helen.
As Sheena was saying, I think some of those contractual risks in terms of being very careful that you have adequate coverage at the start for any risks that might pop up during the life of the project. And certainly from previous experience of working internationally, making sure that cash flow risk is well covered at the start, because it's very easy, and we are all naturally optimistic at the start of a project in terms of how long it will take us to deliver and how everything will go well in the relationship with partners and the client team, but it isn't always the case. And so actually running some of those objective scenarios about what could happen in the worst case is I've found really useful.
Yeah, I mean, the insurance cover point that you mentioned is a really important one, because, you know, consultants in the UK rely upon their professional indemnity insurance and the other insurances they might have in place to provide that sort of risk, sort of comfort. But in the UAE, just as an example, you have the liquidated damages point I've mentioned. You've got decennial liability, which we don't have in the UK, which is a 10 years, so it's an extended period liability for that can bite both contractors and design professionals where there are structural issues that occur on a project, so up to 10 years after completion. But the UK insurers will not insure it. And what we're hearing is that decennial liability may become compulsory to get insurance for decennial liability in the UAE pretty soon. And there's that mismatch between what the insurers are prepared to cover, and they're very traditional UK insurers are not used to, you know, they're looking to protect their risk, and they don't have a great appetite for anything new. It took them ages to get their head around BIM, for example. So there is that mismatch that consultants need to be aware of, because it's not like the sort of traditional risks that consultants are used to having insurance for. So it is quite an important area.
Hannah.
I wonder whether with some of that, I mean, part of this exercise of looking at where we would like to work and where we see the biggest markets, I guess if it throws up some questions in certain jurisdictions like that, I mean, I wonder whether there's something in terms of, you know, the types of products that UK Export Finance provide. And if we say, actually, there's a really big market here, and, you know, we could be in it and offering, you know, sort of a lot of our capability overseas, but actually this is what's stopping us. And is that something which, as far as the British government's concerned, an area where they might want to step in? I think there's absolute value in us doing that as a collective, because I think, you know, again, if that is something that helps us differentiate with others that might be wanting to move into those markets, it could be hugely valuable.
Yeah, I mean, certainly doing that would be great, because the only examples I've seen of government getting involved has been on big projects which have gone badly wrong, where a US architect went back to government contacts that they had to say, can you get involved and help us? And it was too late, really. So yeah, no, I definitely support.
Yes.
Support that.
Yeah, I think one of the and we actually had in the International Business Group, we did have a presentation some while ago from UK export finance, and I think that was quite unknown to most parts of the infrastructure sector. And so they, in response to things like tender bonds or performance bonds, or in international development, you often get early payment bonds, which your banks effectively look at as a debt, because if it had to be repaid, it would have to be repaid. And so what UK Export Finance do is provide preferential rates for those bonding facilities, which I really don't think are actually advertised and understood enough by finance directors and by our commercial teams. And they have a regional network in the UK as well as being based in London. So that is something I would certainly recommend organisations do have a look at.
Sounds like something for the business development handbook club.
Possibly. So I think we'll open the call for questions in a moment, but I had just a couple of other observations, which I'm sure Sheena will recognise this, and having worked with Sheena in a capacity where she was providing advice on some of our difficult projects. I think the thing you realise is that keeping appropriate records and having policy and procedure is important for anything you do. But if you're operating overseas, it becomes a significantly added requirement. And so we're finding now, we do a lot of work with UK government. So UK government, particularly the UK Foreign Office and DFID, are now imposing a significant set of requirements upon businesses who work with them to put in place safeguarding process and procedure, which a lot of people might not necessarily understand, but it comes from the situation that occurred in Haiti, where Oxfam were found guilty of an awful lot of things. So organisations working in that environment need to make sure that their policies and procedures are absolutely up to date. And that's a costly exercise that you wouldn't necessarily always think about in recovering fees. So you need to think about how fees will recover the overhead of putting in place those policy and procedures. Ethics becomes a hugely important aspect. So going back through the governance and the process that one goes through. And as far as the ethics is concerned, that isn't just about our ability as consultancies to pass the anti-bribery and corruption test, but it's also around identifying, and there is software available now which can look at where your supply chain payments go. Because what you don't want to do is find that you are found guilty of payments to partners or consortia that you're working within. Find the money either from a donor or from a government customer or a beneficiary is finding its way down a supply chain that we might have no control over into something that then is either into anti-bribery, corruption, or worse still, funding international terrorism, for example. So there is stuff that needs to be done to make sure that our policies and procedures can stand test. So for me, I'll come back to the start, which was very, very much about governance. Okay, so one of the questions that's come in is, what is the key thing for SMEs to remember when trying to work overseas? I would have said the important thing to remember here is that it's going to be quite a difficult step for an SME to do that work without necessarily looking at the opportunity of partnering with organisations who have already got that kind of footprint. As Sheena has mentioned, and as I have, there are a number of areas that would need to be understood. So I think I would look at identifying a range of organisations that you feel comfortable in working with to provide that broader set of support and opportunity to get into some of those jurisdictions. Because, for example, we had an interesting discussion yesterday. I'll use Canada as an example. We understand Canada has quite a significant infrastructure investment program, but Canada is an enormous country with several time zones. The UK wouldn't necessarily be welcomed into Quebec, and as we know, over in British Columbia and Vancouver, there isn't going to be not a large population and not a great deal of work. So whilst Canada might be an interesting area to go and look at, you need to be very precise about where in Canada, because the largest population are all on the border with the US. So the US do work in Canada, but the Canadians are actually quite interested in working with Brits. But be very clear about where you're actually going to target. So find parts of the world where, I think as Helen mentioned earlier, there are some easy entry.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that, Clive, on SMEs would be, we see them going into sub-consultancy arrangements for larger with larger consultants, as you say, collaborating in that sense. Being very careful about the clauses that allow payment to come down to them is important, because payment quite often gets stuck on the basis of a payment provision, as I've said. I mean, joint venturing is much more common in the UK. Overseas, we see quite a lot of cross-border JVs. Interestingly, FIDIC have got a standard form joint venture agreements for cross-border JVs. They don't have one actually for domestic JVs, but they do for cross-border, so that's something that could be looked at. But all of the points that I've mentioned apply equally, obviously, to SMEs, just to from the legal side anyway, in terms of going to work abroad.
Yes, and if I may, I think the other point to pick out from that, and just something I jotted down in my notebook earlier, which is that particularly for SMEs who may well be used to working in terms and conditions that are generally around something that's either through the NEC suite of contracts, or, for instance, the ACE or Joint Contracts Tribunal, or a whole range of recognisable contracting methods. It's quite clear to me that wherever possible, if you can, let's try and leverage something that is recognisable internationally, and therefore the FIDIC suite of contracts would be something that would have some recognisable, balanced terms and conditions, and would support consultancies in that environment. Often it's difficult to do so, but if possible, I would certainly support that as a contracting framework.
I would add a really positive point to those kinds of cautionary tales a little bit, which is that there are a huge number of people and a real community within British business that will help. So I have found, working for both a large company where I've helped SMEs with some of the processes and experience that we're happy to share, but equally working for an SME for a short time myself, that actually the business community facilitated by ACE and the institutions has got a great deal of personal support, as well as those frameworks that you can call about that you were talking to. And I have found that there is a really strong camaraderie within the group of people working on international projects in terms of actually sharing their experience and helping each other.
Thank you, Helen.
Sorry to interrupt. I've got another question that's just come in from one of our listeners. They've asked, how do you keep on top of all the variations that occur in a region like Southeast Asia, where you're running projects and managing clients in a number of countries that will all be different in their approaches?
I think if I can maybe attempt to respond on that question. I mean, if the listener is asking about legal variations and changes, it's a very good question, because certainly in our experience, even having an office ourselves in the UAE, we find that law changes and decrees are issued without notice, and it can change your course. So business planning, which all sensible businesses do, needs to have that sort of flexibility built in, and more regular reviews, I would say, of what your plans are, and being able to be nimble and adapt to any changes, of course, that might occur in terms of changes in the law or the requirements on the design profession. But if the listener is really asking about variations on projects and in relation to specific construction projects, I think the answer is back to Clive's point about records, and you know, it is so essential, whether it's wherever the project may be, that there are good records. And what we find, surprisingly, with design professionals more than contractors, I shouldn't say surprisingly because contractors have been doing it for many, many more years, is lack of operation of the contract. You know, consultants will not follow what the contract says, and you know, it's still to this day kept in the drawer and not looked at. It's signed and therefore we can forget about it. So there's steps that are required that are very often strict, onerous obligations are just not followed. I mean, I've left to finish off when I get back to my desk a piece of advice to a client about where they can go. They've not followed through on a contractual provision which requires them to provide notice, and therefore giving them advice about where they can go from that is very difficult. So it is records that really is the mantra on changes that might occur in a project.
I would pick up on that and say probably that point around really frequent review. So reviewing not just your delivery and your contract on a portfolio or program of projects in a region, but actually what else is changing. So what else is changing politically, economically, within the wider environment in which you're working is part of your risk management approach for that portfolio within your business. And so that would be my addition.
Hannah.
I was going to say, I think the, you know, I would say this as somebody who comes from a political background, but utilising that network with the Department for International Trade and the embassies, they will see things coming officially and unofficially that will affect your business working in those sorts of countries. So they are a very, very good source of information, both in terms of what they publish, but actually having, you know, developing those relationships with them, because if they know what your risks are in those countries, actually they will start to get wind of things. You know, they're very, very, very good network of professionals really, and their role is to understand exactly what is going on in that country. So I would certainly try to utilise those and build those relationships, because it is, although you might not know why at the time, they will be useful to you.
I can only endorse that, Hannah. I think that many of us think that we see the embassy as being something that you go to when there's a problem. I've lost my passport, I need to go and sort something out. Rather than actually now, because we do a lot of work with the embassy program for the Foreign Office, there's an expansion program going on where much larger numbers of other government department representatives will be in the embassies. So we know that there's generally there'll be a defence advisor there. There's now going to certainly be DFID represented. So there's a plan to bring all of government together. So there's sort of one HMG overseas plan that's been talked about for a while. And so I think the advice for me would be make sure that you have good contacts and good relationships with Post, because the embassies can provide you with an awful lot of advice and guidance and support when things get difficult. Defence attaché, sorry, that's what I was thinking of. Right, do we need to read that next long question?
Okay, I think I can summarise. I've had a read. So it's discussing the approach taken in other countries around how their governments would look to open doors and sell them overseas, and all around developing that sort of common narrative of actually, you know, for people like Department for International Trade to do their best for us, and UK infrastructure exports to do their best. We need to sort of give them a common narrative of what it is that we're selling and where we're interested in going. So this, I think, links a little bit back to what we were doing. And actually, I guess the question looks as if it's, you know, around trying to put some of those wheels in motion. So Clive, I know this is something that we've discussed and that we are looking to take forward. And obviously we've got the international business group, but actually we have got our, in ACE, our sector interest groups as well. Which I think, you know, this question refers specifically to the water group. Yeah. I do think there is some scope to start to involve those as we develop that offer. But I think what's really important in the next few months is actually we get consensus amongst the consultancy community on what it is that we're selling. I don't know if you wanted to add to that with your thoughts, Clive, around how we could do that more effectively than we might do at the moment.
I think Stephen, who's asked the question, has hit on an important point there, because we had 3 hours yesterday, and if you think about trying to cover the globe, and also think about the sectors and the services that you might want to look at focusing on, it becomes quite a difficult 3-hour discussion. So what we did agree was that Tam Simmons is going to summarise the output notes from yesterday, but it will lead to a follow-on workshop where we'll be looking a little bit more at the sector-based approach and how that will link in with the other group chairs within the ACE for those very same reasons, because we talked, didn't we, about what opportunities there might be, for example, in South America. And whilst the Department for International Trade might see that there's huge links into South America, and TfL may as well, it's still a difficult place for UK consultancies to go and work unless they get the right kind of Spanish or Portuguese partner to go along with them. So the refinement of that is then saying which geographies, what sectors, and the services that we believe someone wants to buy. And then the final piece, the fourth piece of that dimension is what is the competition that already exists, because there might be lots of work and there may be an investment, but the market may already be saturated. So one of the things we identified was New Zealand is still a place that would welcome UK support. They've got a large infrastructure investment program, but not an overly saturated supply, but don't want to be necessarily reliant upon the Asia Pacific partners to come and support them on that work. So that's the next filter we're going to apply to it. Sorry, that was a long answer. I apologise.
So I had something I wanted to just, I guess, reflect on before we finish, and that was one of the points that Helen started with, and actually something I didn't realise around how TfL, International Consulting, came into being, which was all about developing the staff. And actually that's a whole new take on our skills angle around, what do we need to do as an industry? What can we offer? Why would someone come into construction when they could go into accountancy or law? Sorry, Sheena. But I think, that is actually something that we could have that I think would be really, really interesting and tangible. It's not that you're going overseas and providing, advice and doing things on the computer. You're actually going overseas and you're going to leave a legacy of something that you've designed. I think that's, that could be hugely powerful, actually, for the sorts of, values that we see for the people who are coming out of universities and through the apprenticeships now.
So if I may on that, employing quite a large number of graduates and apprentices and young people coming into our organisation, it is the case that many people actually come out from various degree courses in our sector, some of them non-cognate, join our organisation and actually have a real desire to go and make the world a better place. And this is an opportunity to give them that release. And many of them follow that kind of international development into the DFID world, but there's a huge and pressing requirement in infrastructure to support the developing world. So we see it as a massive recruitment drive to be able to say to people coming into our organisation, look, you can develop your careers. You might actually have a geography degree, but actually we're working on programs that you can use that degree and develop your career. So I think it is a massive piece for us. And one thing I did jot down here is the other piece, particularly for the SME community, is look at the training, particularly in the cultural areas around people who might be UK expats going to work overseas, because we get support, and I'm not plugging them, but there are organisations like International SOS who will provide you with that. So we have an end-to-end travel plan. So wherever I plan to go in the world, I have to make sure I'm, so this is another thing, medically fit to travel, because duty of care is another massive issue. So make sure that your staff are medically fit to travel. Make sure they understand the travel risk assessments and the cultural appreciation of where they're going. And International SOS can help dramatically with that. So going back to making sure you've got the appropriate policy procedure and records in place. If you are sending people to challenging parts of the world, it's important that you've got something on record other than we book them a flight and we book them into a hotel. because when someone isn't experienced and they land at a new country and don't know whether to get in a cab or not, you are not discharging your duty of care for sending people to different parts of the world. So
this is you now providing all of these red flags.
well,
certainly what everyone's discussing is so exciting. I mean, the idea of a young apprentice or a graduate getting the opportunity to go abroad and work, and the diversity that creates and the mix of different backgrounds.
It's great, but you need to make sure that you provide the appropriate training for those individuals so that they are equipped to.
Very, very easy to get caught out. I know a colleague of mine, when he landed in Dubai, walked into the metro and went into a ladies only carriage to be stared at by all of these ladies and sort of and ushered out very quickly.
And if you do that kind of thing in Saudi Arabia, you'll end up in prison.
Very important.
So on that final note of exciting places, but I would like to go back to that point about it's a really wonderful way of encouraging quality graduates, quality apprentices and young people into our organisation if you can show them that there's an opportunity to go and work and make the world a better place, as I say. Okay. Well,